Hello and welcome to another edition of the Security Visionaries podcast. Today's episode is an absolute corker for anyone who's a sports fan, or I suppose anyone who likes any sort of physical live event. My guest today is Ben Morris. He is the Group Head of Cybersecurity for World Rugby. And today he's joining me to chat about the intersection of cyber and physical security. So welcome to the podcast, Ben.
Thank you very much for having me, and excited to delve into the world not just of cybersecurity, which obviously I'm going to be biased, but naturally sport as well, and how they interchange with the world that we find ourselves in today. So yeah, very excited to dig into it today.
Excellent. Now, if you don't mind, there is so much that I want to ask you about, and I know we're on the clock, so can I just dive straight in?
Absolutely, yeah. Keen to.
Brill. All right, so my first question, when we talk about modern security challenges, we very often zoom straight into the lack of consistent physical environment and see it as a problem. We talk a lot about the challenges of remote work, for instance. And I suppose we're doing that, we're harking back to a more straightforward time where physical location was a controlled environment. But I suspect you're going to tell me that physical environments can add complexity and it doesn't necessarily make life easier. So could you give a quick overview of some of the complexities that are involved when the location itself is a dominant character in your security plans?
Yeah, with the responsibility of World Rugby being a major event organiser, there's so much of a heavy reliance on physical venue and the presence. And unless you have a way of moving a stadium from country to country, that isn't going to be the case. So the challenge that we face is we have venues we have to secure, we have devices always on the move, we got local operating companies all across the world. It's a diverse challenge. So how do you provide a secure environment for these physical venues, the coffee shop enthusiasts, all that kind of stuff? And I don't think sport's unique in that challenge, but I think sport has really been forced to think differently around security. So nowadays, when we're talking about organising a major event, we now have to consider all those elements. So it's significantly evolved. I'm spending more of my time on the physical security element of the venue, more so than anything else nowadays. And with that, the complexities of how do we provide that zero kind of performance hit, really robust security and such. So we've had to really evolve our ecosystem and our architecture around zero trust, cloud first, providing richness when it comes to DLP, but all over the world. So yeah, not an easy topic to digest, but yeah, it's significantly involved the complexity of managing major events nowadays.
So I guess for listeners that are less familiar with World Rugby, it's probably worth pointing out you're not the security lead at Stamford Bridge, or I looked up a US stadium name. So I'm going to say Michigan Stadium. You're not a security manager at a physical venue like that. You are in charge of security of a sport that travels around the world. And much like something like Formula One, rocks up in different cities throughout different tournaments. Does that make your job completely different to the people that might be responsible for a specific static sports venue?
It does. And there's a lot of responsibility to building really solid relationships with dedicated venues, such as you mentioned Stamford Bridge as a case in point. In the UK, we're running the Women's World Cup next year, and there's 8 to 9 venues. We have no responsibility over these venues. We have a contractual agreement in place, but there's no obligation for these venues to go, yeah, we're just going to let you rebuild our whole network. These venues are multi-purpose. So on a Saturday and Sunday, they might run a rugby event. On Monday, they might be running a live concert, or they might be running a completely different event. So the challenge that we face as an organization is like, how do we instill the standards that we really are looking for as a governing body and a major federation on these venues, but also make it rewarding for the venue to help us on that journey. The complexity when it comes to the venues, I'm just putting my if I was a venue manager, is I can't build to one set of standards that World Rugby are saying, also build to standards that maybe a major concert like a Taylor Swift will be saying. And, we've got the Euros in 2028. Maybe UEFA are going to stipulate some standards as well. We can't just keep building. So what, as World Rugby, and my role really is required, is what are the minimum requirements that are transferable to the venue, to other major event organisers. So when we're finished next year in 2025, UEFA can come in and go in, oh, they've got all this stuff in place already, and the venue feel comfortable that they can show these standards that we've helped evolve. And that's the responsibility of any major governing body, not just World Rugby, but we're talking about the likes of FIFA and the Olympics and UEFA and NFL. Just I could keep naming on the federations. It's our responsibility as a global sport to make sure we uplift the standards of venues, help at that risk versus reward kind of situation when it comes to investments and cost to a venue. So yeah, that's my role. Is I am merely a elevator of standards, and I've got my minimum requirements to go. You need to make sure you got like MFA, or you need to make sure you secure your devices properly, you train your staff. For that instance, it's making sure like we're uplifting the whole of sport, not just being really selfish, going you have to follow my standards, because that's just not going to get anybody anywhere.
And so, if you become essentially a bit of a standards body, or someone that's setting a best practice, how
Mm.
closely are you aligning with other organizations that do that? I'm thinking perhaps governments that also have security standards. Are there some best practices that you take from government regulations, or are governments, in some respects, looking to you for advice on what they should be putting into their national requirements?
It's a bit of both. So naturally, the government isn't just beholden to sports or entertainment. They've got a raft of requirements across different sectors. I'm going to use the UK as a prime case in point. The NCSC, we have a really strong relationship with the NCSC because we recognise that we're playing catch up in venue and stadium. And technology is evolving so quickly now. It's not at the cutting edge of technology investments. So they also need our feedback and our requirements going as a major event organizer. This is where we're moving the goalposts. And I'm going to lean onto the cybersecurity aspect here. Is there isn't really what I could say a global standard for securing a venue when it comes to cybersecurity. I feel that's going to significantly evolve over the next 4 years
Mm.
because historically venues have been a very physical health and safety ecosystem, and naturally so. The safety of fans, safety of players, the welfare of all those elements has always been paramount. So there's a real good process in place already at a national level, not just in the UK. We're talking globally here around that. So there's very strict requirements on physical security. Cybersecurity, as you all know, has changed even just in the last year, never mind the last 10 years. So the government, and not just in the UK, everybody is playing catch up when it comes to cybersecurity requirements. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about is making sure we uplift all of stadia and all of venues to a particular set of standards, and using the UK with its amplification and its connections to go, okay, we like these standards from the private sector, from sport. And why don't we put that into a blueprint? So when there is a new stadium being created, there's multiple stadiums being built even just this year, make sure they follow these standards. And then
Mm.
using the same framework and the same auditing procedures that they have around physical safety, why don't we make sure we check cybersecurity as well, and trying to mandate and build the maturity in that? So that's how we're working with government. Just on that side, there's lots of other areas that we do work with government on, but that is a particular one that I'm passionate about and really heavily involved in, is uplifting the whole of Stadia and using the UK government and its connections to amplify the message.
And how about, you've talked a little bit there about physical security perhaps being slightly ahead in terms of regulations and what's expected and standards. When push comes to shove and you're looking at a particular event, how are you working with that physical security team? Are they completely separate to you, or are you integrated?
There's two separate teams with different, I guess, goals and objectives when it comes to a major event. However, if you asked me 10 years ago, I can guarantee they probably had no communications, or if any. Nowadays, it's you very much conjoined at the hip when it comes to physical security. It's absolutely essential. So if you think about how interconnected venues are, you have so many touch points. You have lots of IoT devices, you have point of sale devices, you have turnstiles, you have HVAC systems. All these are now digital. They're
Mm.
digital connection points. Before, you might have just isolated it on its own. You have maybe a contractor comes into the venue and supports that. That's no longer the case. A lot of these is somebody remote is monitoring it on some system. So nowadays, as particularly at World Rugby, we are just one of the same. So we have collaborative working groups regular when it comes to the major events. So we're working every single I think it's every fortnight, we get together talking about the physical security of the venue, the cybersecurity practices, and how all those are interlinked. Because you can have the best physical security system in the world, but if it's exposed from a cybersecurity perspective, it's so vulnerable. And now, you're hearing horror stories of people turning off turnstiles when it comes to major events. We don't want that, and it's that's the element that cybersecurity can bleed into physical security, because if you turn off the turnstiles, you can no longer guarantee the health and safety of not just people outside the venue trying to get in, but the people in the venue as well. So that's just an entry and exit system. Then we're talking about accreditation, making sure the right people are going into a venue at the right time, making sure they have the right access. What if someone compromises that system? So nowadays, physical security and cybersecurity are kind of just prioritized at the same level, which is really, really good. But the challenge that we have in cybersecurity, we don't really have prescripted standards. Physical security, they're really well established. They have really strong connections with local government, local police as well. So now, when you talk about the working group in World Rugby, you've not just got the cybersecurity and physical security, you've got Metropolitan Police, you've got transportation, you have the Home Office, DCMS. All of us are in the same call. There's a reason for that, because they're so interconnected in that instance. So you're completely right. There is no longer a really clear separation when it comes to physical security and cyber. It's kind of one of the same, and you have responsible people in each areas driving their own initiatives, but working in collaboration with each other.
So my next question is a little bit lighthearted. When we first spoke, I frivolously threw out a load of movie and TV show examples that play with the idea of physical and cybersecurity. We were talking about Ocean's 11, Logan Lucky, Prison Break. And in fact, it was about 24 hours before the UK's Ministry of Justice announced that the prison plans had been leaked on the dark web that I was saying, well, is Prison Break a real concern? So I felt very prescient with that. But I wanted to find out, who got it most right, do you think, in terms of popular culture? Where do we find a as accurate as we can get representation of your world in the movies or TV?
Yeah, I remember when we had a brief chat about this one. It was quite interesting because when you look at the dramatization of like Ocean's 11, there's elements of that which are quite realistic, but a lot of it is quite far-fetched. So, Ocean's 11, I think there's a real good element in that when it comes to social engineering and disguises. So it's very easy for somebody to do some reconnaissance of an organization, what people dress up as, what the security staff dress up as, looking at your accreditation, looking at your key cards, and replicating that and trying to find their way into a venue. So Ocean's 11, yes, although absolutely wild and far-fetched, there is elements of that which is transferable. Then if I think about Prison Break, similar when it comes to like in the insider threat. Do you really know all your staff? How many background checks do you do on the people? Can you trust them people? Are they reliable? And that's the same at a major venue. Like if you're going to bring in all this steward staff and physical security, can you verify everybody who they say they are? Has somebody cloned somebody else's pass and managed to get in? So yes, again, Prison Break is very dramatized and naturally to make it entertaining, but there is elements to that. For my because you mentioned like who really does justice to cybersecurity when it comes to entertainment. There isn't like an outlier. I think I use Mr. Robot. It's probably the main one that I go to because it shows a blend of how much sophistication goes into that initial access piece, how much reconnaissance, how much social engineering, how much can you scrape on like a Facebook or a LinkedIn, can you catch about somebody's identity and play around with that. And then it's the technical ability of transferring all that reconnaissance and intelligence and knowledge of an environment and then and then building it into technical. So yes, it is all very dramatized, and I can say with a high degree of certainty, Prison Break, Ocean's 11 and such, there's probably 95% of it which is far-fetched, but there is that 5% which is quite accurate, and it's an area which us as cybersecurity professionals keeps us up at night because it's the what ifs and stuff like that.
Well, thank you for letting me ask that one. I'll move to a more serious question, my next one, which is that when you think about things like the Rugby World Cup, the Football World Cup, the Olympics, these 4-year cycles seem to come in a lot. I don't know why 4 years, but I was wondering, do you, when you're working on these 4-year cycles, sort of decamp and then strike everything anew for the next one, or do do you have to come up with a whole new security approach for every World Cup, or do you have continuity of teams and processes? How do you build that as a long-term approach?
So I think if you could ask me this question 4 years ago, it was very much a build it, tear it down, start again approach. And that's not just a unique thing for World Rugby. Everybody who's did that, you've probably all heard the stories of the Olympics where they go to a host nation, they build all the infrastructure, run the event, and off they go to the next one. Nowadays, that's just not a sustainable model. For all the federations, sustainability and reuse is one of the key objectives for us. And what we recognise is during that 4 year cycle, um, we tie up our time in other areas, refining that framework, refining that blueprint. So, for example, World Rugby, we probably work off more 2 year cycles. So every 4 years we have a men's World Cup, then we have a women's World Cup 2 years later. So it's more like 2 year cycles. But now
Mm.
with governing bodies, we have events during those, I'd say, quiet years. So that really refines that blueprint. So when we go to a host nation now, we have a list of frameworks. So at World Rugby, we have 45, I think it is, frameworks that we have developed over this period of time. I think World Rugby has been going for 137 years. So we're pretty decent
Wow.
at it now when it comes to going to a host nation. We've got a major event. And okay, these are the things that we need to do. The reason why it's in kind of 4 year cycles because there's a lot of preparation and planning that needs to go into major events. And this is the sustainability pieces. You can't do that with temporary staff that are coming in, coming out. So World Rugby is hiring specialist teams. I was part of that specialist team when World Rugby decided that we want to run the major events ourselves. Instead of putting that responsibility on the host nation, World Rugby will do it ourselves. And FIFA's now taken that model, and the Olympics has taken that model, where it's like we'll have a permanent members of staff that are responsible for these frameworks that will then standardize it and repeat it, the repeatability of it. So, and that's why we want to use existing venues and stadiums because it's very hard to do that repeatable model when you're building stuff constantly. So now actually we go to host nations where they've got the infrastructure set up, they've done this before. So
Mm.
now it's all about the organization of the major event, not thinking about the infrastructure and the transportation and such. So the whole this is all across sport. It's become much more sustainable and reusable for that reason, which is good for me because we can iterate upon that blueprint over time. So we're going to learn a lot from 2025. So then for the Men's World Cup in 2027 in Australia, we'd have picked up some lessons learned. We said this worked really well, this didn't,
Hmm.
and then we can refine it over time. So by the time I think the World Cup is 2031 in the US, that model would have been refined for 10 years, and it keeps us on the cutting edge when it comes to emerging technology, emerging threats. So it's really that's where all of the governing bodies and major event kind of organizers are now going, is that refinement, blueprint model, standardization, and repeatability.
So, if you compare a recent Football World Cup, which went to a market where a lot of stadiums were built, especially, and that was why they wanted the World Cup, is to build their infrastructure, with something like the most recent Olympics, where it was all about reusing venues, which of them would you prefer to be in charge of the security for? A complete fresh build or having to grapple with some legacy challenges, but infrastructure that's already there?
So, from a purely cyber perspective, I would love to build new because you can bring in the latest technology. You can make sure it's designed by security by design, effectively. I would prefer that personally. However, when it comes to major events, cybersecurity is only a small fraction of the overall picture when it comes to a major event. So, me as a sports enthusiast and a fan, and you mentioned F1, massive fan, football, rugby, all that kind of stuff. As a fan, I think it's not scalable and it's not healthy for regions where they build all these venues, use it once, and then it just ages. You've
Mhm.
seen the ones in the Olympics, and I think it's a horrible state of affairs. So, actually, as a fan, I prefer the reuse model.
Yeah.
It's more challenging as a cyber professional because you've got this aging infrastructure that you need to modernize. But that's part of the role that you take on, really. So yeah, it's like a 50-50. I'm torn between,
Mhm.
oh, I'd love like a fresh rebuild, I build everything from scratch. Like I'm going to use White Hart Lane, Tottenham's new stadium. They built everything from the ground up. It's all modernized, the greatest technology. That would be brilliant to be on the ground up to build things based on proper standards. Um, but it's not reused null, especially for a major event where it changes its geographical location every 4 years. That's just not the way the world works. So as a fan, I actually prefer the model, which is go to a country, use the physical infrastructure that's there, modernize it to a certain extent so it can keep getting reused. We might go back in 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, whatever it may be. The one thing that people maybe don't understand when it comes to sport is all of the federations work very closely with each other for that reason. So we might run a major event in the US in 2031. We might use a lot of the venues that FIFA is using for 2026. And the reason for that is because the reusing of things, we have a degree of confidence going, oh, the FIFA World Cup was in these stadiums, so it must be able to run our stuff, and vice versa. Same with the Olympics. So we're trying to uplift the overall sport in that degree. So, yeah, a long way to answer your question, but yeah, I think I prefer the reuse model just because of that reason. We're uplifting the existing infrastructure. I think it also modernizes the local area, the people who live there, the citizens, the public. So there's lots of reasons why I think that model is the way to go.
But I knew that would be a tough
sometimes
question when I asked it. I thought you'd be torn.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about the threat landscape, because obviously you're dealing with, the big bad world of some pretty major threats when you're putting on a huge sporting tournament. And I wondered, how do you personally, as well as organisationally, keep up with that evolution of the threats landscape? And then how, if at all, does it impact your plans?
Right. So there's multiple strands to this. I'm gonna talk more locally right now, and then I'll go into more nation state. So locally, when it comes to the way I gather threat intelligence, is through my network and key partners. So we have a lot of strategic investment with technology partners who work for us on that regard, because we're only a small team at World Rugby. There's no way we'll be able to cover the whole threat landscape in any practical way, and digesting that intelligence is just going to be too difficult. So we work with key partners across different kind of specializations. So as an example, we might work with an AWS to give us intelligence around the cloud and what they're seeing. Then we might work with, like, for example, Netskope in regards to what we're seeing on the networking front from a globalization piece. So we work with key partners when it comes to local intelligence that might affect our infrastructure. Then there's other industry peers. So I mentioned just a second ago around our work and collaboration with the federations. We share intelligence with each other because most likely the threats that are going to be targeting us or targeting the Olympics are going to be exactly the same. So we share intelligence that way. We have a working group already between all of the federations sharing that intelligence from cybersecurity and stuff that, we mentioned this year around the Olympics. We had the intelligence from that event that we have reused and made sure to address part of our plans. And the intelligence we have and the Olympics has will be shared with FIFA. So there's the peer level threat intelligence, and then there's more the national or nation threat intelligence, and that's where our collaboration with the NCSC is so important. We don't have the connections when it comes to nation state and what's going on in that ecosystem. So we have to work with the NCSC to understand, are we going to be a target for nation state, and can you support us and give us the intelligence we need to make sure we're best prepared? So a lot of the time when it comes to a major event in a country, you will work with that cybersecurity specialist, the NCSC in this example. You'll generate a threat report for the event, and then you'll get the findings from that going, the most likely credible source is going to be X, and this is what they're going to use. And this is the response plan, and this is what you need to consider. So that's how we, on those three-pronged approach, you've got local with key partners, you've got more kind of federation level with peers, and then you've got more nation state, which is kind of the local government at the time. And all three of those areas kind of give you a clear picture going, what is the threat landscape right now? And that changes all the time. And that's the interesting and challenging and stressful part of cybersecurity is in the UK, okay, well, you're going to be a target because you're one of the 5 eyes. So, you're going to get a number of targets. Hacktivism is very big right now. So these are the areas that are most likely going to affect you in the UK. Then we're moving our major events to Australia, so that's going to change again. And then we're moving again to the US after that. So the threat is changing every single year. So it's an area that you have to invest a lot of time into building those threat intelligence communities. And that's what I'd advise to the listeners. If you haven't set that threat intelligence, think of those 3 levels to try and help you on that. That's what works for me, and it's proved extremely invaluable, explaining the threat to the board, articulating the risk, and the probability of those kind of risks being material, and then the investments that you need to make as a cyber professional to prevent and reduce the impact of disruption at a major event.
And it's just got me thinking, when you're dealing with putting in place your plans for if something went wrong, do your plans involve things like the military? If you're dealing with a huge event, would the police and the military feature in your mitigation plans?
The police big time.
Wow.
Out of all the 8 venues, there's a massive police presence. Their presence in our MOC, which is the main operating centre, they're present throughout. The police are a crucial part of any major event in a country, and that's not just the UK. That is globally. They have to be involved and very early doors, especially when it comes to funding and preparation. The police don't have an infinite amount of funds. They also don't have an infinite amount of operational staff. So the further that they understand that a major event will happen, usually it's part of the bidding process for a major event.
Hmm.
They would be consulted as part of the bidding process for a major event, going, what is the police availability for that year? Part of that preparation also involves the Home Office, where they coordinate that, and they usually allocate a commissioner to help work with the planning side of things. So police is absolutely crucial. They are involved throughout the whole process. Military is a bit of a strange one. So if there is a major event and there might be a strike, or there might be something which impacts the local police ability to protect the public, it's in very rare circumstances that would happen. Usually they'd have volunteers from other counties coming in to support that
Hmm.
bandwidth. I have not been in an instance where the military has been drafted in, but I understand in the past for other events that they have been. I think for the UK government to bring in the military, it's worst case scenario. They haven't
Yeah.
got the staff, they haven't got the police available, and then or maybe the stewards in the ground, just there isn't that private support from companies to support that. So there's multiple decision points, and that comes down to the Home Office. The Home Office are the final people who have that say, and it's based on the ground operational risk to the public and fans and the organisation of the major event. So yeah, fortunately, the military less so. Police absolutely, they're the crucial part of this process.
Brilliant. And then my last question is, you travel around the world. Do you see any significant differences in the way different countries approach events like yours and want to partner with you for the events that you host?
Yeah, I think when it comes to organising major events across the globe, each region has its own degree of maturity when it comes to cybersecurity. Just in my world, some are much more mature and it's a considered standard. I think North America is the blueprint right now. And I think they're fortunate where a lot of their venues and stadiums have been built from the ground up with this in mind. I think Europe is very strong when it comes to its standards and its practicalities. I mentioned the auditing process around physical security. So we're very, very strong, but there is much more investment needed when it comes to cyber. APAC, I feel like, is growing. For rugby, for example, we're seeing the biggest growth in rugby in Asia right now, which is,
Hmm.
when I say that to people, it's like, wow, really? But yeah, Japan and those regions, it's huge right now. And we're seeing massive investments in stadiums because they don't really have the infrastructure to maintain a major event, and they really would like to at some point. So that's the first side, is the infrastructure and the setup to run a major event. It's been very much focused on North America and Central Europe. That's been the de facto for a very, very long time. I think there's opportunities really with other regions where they might not have run a major event before. So they're building their own infrastructure to really modernize. But the main difference is culturally, and how much support the local country is willing to give a major event. The enthusiasm for a major event is the same. The challenge is when it comes to the infrastructure and the maturity of that country around a major event is different. And that's where my role comes into it, to build those blueprints. And that's
Mm.
why as governing bodies, we need to help uplift for the next major event, and that's how things have been transferable. But nothing from a cultural perspective, I would say, changes. It's just a challenge when it comes to maturity of the infrastructure.
So, sport is an international universal language, and so is cybersecurity.
Well, yeah, I'd say so. The different stages of kind of common language, and I think watch this space over the next couple of years. I reckon sport is going to be the ones where we really uplift, and I think the reason for that is just the transferability and the sustainability of the game. And it's been now globally recognised, not just in sport, but most sectors, that cybersecurity is one of the biggest risks that's going to be targeting us. And I think with
Mm.
that, it's now being recognised as one of those areas that we need to focus on. So yeah, it is a transferable language, less so in other regions than others, but I'm sure that will change.
Brilliant. Well, Ben, this has been absolutely fascinating. Honestly, I could talk to you for ages about this. And my sister is a massive rugby fan. So with this episode, we're picking up at least one more listener. So she's going to love this
Result.
conversation as
Result.
well. It's a win. Thank you very much for giving me your time.
Thank you very much for having me, and hopefully your listeners have learned a little bit more about sports and cybersecurity and interchangeability. But yeah, pleasure talking today, and looking forward to many more in the future.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben. You have been listening to the Security Visionaries podcast, and I've been your host, Emily Wearmouth. If you enjoyed this episode and you